This is the Book Legion Podcast, where we review thought-provoking books to give our Legionnaires the knowledge they need to dominate the next level of their life.
Hey everybody, this is Ty on the Book Legion. This week I'm going to be covering James Lawrence, who is the Iron Cowboy, his book, Redefine Impossible. So I originally had heard of James Lawrence, the Iron Cowboy, I believe on Andy Frisella's podcast about a year and a half back. And what I had heard was just like unbelievable. It was almost unfathomable what this man had gone through, and that's what the book's predicated on. We're going to jump into. But first, I want to let you guys know who James Lawrence is, the Iron Cowboy. James Lawrence is originally from Calgary, Canada, currently lives in Utah with his family. He is married to his wife of a long time, Sunny Joe. They have 5 kids together, 4 girls and 1 boy. And family is a really reoccurring theme throughout the book, his wife and his kids, and we'll get into that a little bit that as well. But James really kind of was a little bit of I wouldn't say a drifter is the right word, but he kind of just floated from job to job to job. Nothing that was really capturing his intention with really what he wanted to do with life. Then he got introduced to endurance sports, and that he was just hooked, and he wanted to find a way to be able to do endurance sports and push himself to the limits while also being able to support his family. And through this process of what he called the 50-50-50, which was what the book is based on, he's been able to do that through sponsorships and cultivating different types of relationships. But what the book is predicated on, Redefine Impossible, is James, again, got really involved in endurance sports and triathlons in particular, and set a couple different world records about completing a certain amount of triathlons within a certain amount of time. But someone who was just really kind of obsessed with mental toughness, he wanted to find out how far could he push himself mentally and physically. And so they came up with this idea, and the idea was predicated around fighting child obesity. And so he wanted to do a charity, a fundraising event through endurance sports to help fight child obesity. Something he's really passionate about. His mother struggled with weight her whole life, and so it was something that was always a reoccurring theme in his life, being around people that just struggled with weight. So he wanted to help, it starts with the children, so he wanted to be able to help deliver that message and be able to give to charities that help support fighting child obesity. So what he decided to do was to run 50 triathlons, 50 days in a row in all 50 states. Now, those of you who aren't familiar with what a triathlon was, or an Ironman triathlon, let me break it down for you. It's a 2.3 mile swim, a 112 mile bike ride, followed by a 26.2 mile marathon, all in one day. And the guy decided to do 50 of these, 50 days in a row in all 50 states. So that was what the book is about his journey of going through the 50-50-50 and just the mental, the physical, emotional toll that it took on him and how he overcame. So without further ado, let's jump into my 3 favorite chapters. So the first chapter I want to talk to you guys about is chapter 5. Don't get too high and don't get too low. What I really liked about this chapter, because this happens all the time to everybody in everyday life, is that we tend to get really high in our highs and really low in our lows. And what James was explaining going through this period was that he had this period where he was in Georgia. He was in Georgia and Florida. And in Florida, he had a really special moment with his kids on the beach, and he felt really energized and he felt really good, the best he had felt in a couple of weeks. His body at this point, he was on day 22, 23, had really been taking a thrashing, already having to overcome some injuries. And for whatever reason, he just felt really great. Everything was clicking. He felt good about being at the beach, and he pushed himself a little too hard. He got a little too high and pushed himself a little too hard. And then the next day, he really had to suffer the ramifications of going a little too hard and not having that balance. And so that was kind of what I took away from a lot of this book. Is a lot of us, especially myself, like to live in extremes. I work really hard, or I play really hard. Even when I'm on vacation, I vacation really hard. And I think that that's okay. I don't think that always obtaining balance is possible. I think it's impossible, but I still think that you have to be cognizant of always obtaining balances. This is why when you're like in a slump, don't get too low. Don't beat yourself up too much. Don't have that negative self-talk. Look at ways where you can start to pick yourself back up quickly. And when you're on a high, realize that You're not going to stay there, right? You're never going to stay on top of the mountain. It doesn't matter how much money you're worth, how much you've been winning in your life, how many times you've won. You always get knocked down off the throne. We've seen all the legends in sports and business at some point or many points in their lives, they've had great highs and very, very low lows. Look at Steve Jobs, started Apple, got kicked out of Apple, came back to Apple, blew up Apple. People can have these highs, extremes in their life, and James talks about, how to have a little bit more balance. You don't get too high, you don't get too low. And it was interesting using this metaphor while being involved in endurance sports. I got a lot of big takeaway from chapter 5. So the next chapter I want to talk to you guys about, chapter 13, which is titled Angry Elf. So there was a point in the race where James was in New Jersey, and it was just a rough patch of the way the water temperature was when he was trying to complete the 2.3 mile swim. Then the biking was way hillier than he thought, which, he's trying to exert as little energy as possible to make it through 50 of these Ironmans. And then he had issues with the running. And so, he was just in a big funk. And he talks about how he was snapping at people. And he was working with his massage therapist, who started kind of talking to him about the mindset and why he was so angry and why he was so frustrated. And he had to get to the bottom of really what his frustration was. It really wasn't the biking, the swimming, or even the running. Those were all contributing factors, but he was frustrated with his team. And he was getting so frustrated with his team that it was starting to affect him physically. And this happens to a lot of us that we don't always recognize. And this was my big takeaway from the chapter, is that we get into these points where we have something that doesn't go right in life. And we don't realize that the negative self-talk and the negative energy and the drama and chaos that we can create in our lives can manifest physically into sickness, into illness, into deeper states of depression, can start to have more panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And it all starts right here. So the better you can control your temperature, if you've got issues with your relationships at home or with your kids or with your colleagues or with your boss, you got to flush them out. And so that's what he had to do with this, is just become radically open and transparent about the frustrations he was having with his team, so they didn't manifest into anything more physical than what he was already going through. Because again, obviously, he's going through something that no one had ever done before. And I don't know that anybody else may ever do again with doing the 50-50-50. So it was important for me, again, to put in perspective that our thoughts shape our reality. And if our thoughts aren't congruent to feed ourselves positivity and to have always a good perspective, then it can really go awry when it comes to your physical and mental health. The last chapter I want to talk to you guys about is chapter 16, Living on a Prayer, which obviously is a Bon Jovi song, but I really found really heartfelt and a lot of warmth and a lot of love from this chapter. Was James talks about how that was him and his wife's song, Living on a Prayer. Again, I kind of mentioned that he'd gone through some of his own personal struggles with trying to find the right type of meaningful work for them. But through that struggle, it put their family in a bad position financially. They were kind of floating from house to house. When they were renting a house, they had, eviction notices, that type of stuff. And so that kind of became a theme song for him and his wife. But they always had each other. And through this whole process, they had each other. And he always goes back to the love of his wife and his family to get him through everything. And that just meant a lot to me, being a husband, being a father, and someone. The only reason I go to work and my sense of purpose and why is for my family. So I could really relate a lot to what he was trying to do. And it got to a point where his body was so deteriorated and he was so gone. I mean, he fell asleep on his bike and it crashed. Constantly, he's laid down more than 10 seconds, he was out asleep. I mean, he was completely thrashed, what he was trying to accomplish. And so this chapter just really digs in about faith, love, and resiliency. And that's really what it's predicated on. And a lot of us, we need that in our life. We need to have faith, love, and resiliency. Because if we had more of that, we'd be able to overcome a lot more. Again, life's going to throw challenges at you. Buddha has a saying, life is suffering. But it's how you find meaning in the suffering that matters. And so the more that we can rely on our faith and our love and our resilience and overcome and endure and appreciate our small victories and our small wins, they don't have to be a 50-50-50 like James accomplished, then the better we are and the more we can help and the more we can serve. And so I took a lot away from this chapter, Living on a Prayer. It was really just touching reading about him and his wife's relationship. You know, throughout the whole book, he has all kinds of great stories that people that every event he did a Ironman 5K, where a 5K is like 2.5 miles, where people would run with him at the end or beginning of his marathon, because he always did the swimming, biking, and running last. And he got to hear just incredible life-changing stories about people who had overcome. People that weighed 300 pounds, lost 120 pounds. People that were struggling with depression. All kinds of stuff that people would go out and they would talk to him, and he was filling people up as much as he was being drained mentally, emotionally, and physically. He was inspiring thousands and thousands of people, now millions, with his book, and he has a great documentary based on the book. So for me, the book was more about stories. It was more about his legacy. There is definitely, you have to extract the wisdom and the metaphors and the analogies within the book. It's not a book about, he's not going to give you, here's 1, 2, 3 steps to having a tough mindset. The book is really just predicated on everything he went through. It's his whole story. And through his whole story, you get to learn about himself, what he went through, his inner thoughts. He was very vulnerable in the book, I thought, with where he was at, the times he wanted to quit, having to deal with people trolling him online, the haters online that say that he was doing things not the right way because he didn't want to be in a thunderstorm and use an elliptical, for one of the marathons, stuff like that, which was, I think it was crazy, and those people are fucking weird for trying to knock the guy down while he's trying to give his body, his mind, his soul, his everything to a good cause for children. It's kind of crazy, but that's besides the point. So anyway, I highly recommend the book. If you want to read about someone who did something that no one else has ever accomplished, again, I don't know if it can be done again. 50 Ironmans in 50 days in a row in 50 states is absolutely crazy. But it really shows you what you're capable of when you're committed up here. And the more of us that could be committed in our minds 100% to our jobs, to our families, to ourselves, to our church, to our faith, or to our spirituality, to the world, we'd all be in a much better place, as opposed to just kind of playing small and living mediocre lives. James has not done that. He's pushed himself to the limits of what somebody can endure physically, mentally, and emotionally. So check out the book. I highly recommend it. Again, it's called Redefine Impossible by James Lawrence, the Iron Cowboy. Just a heads up, he is going to be doing something just as crazy potentially. I think the big part of the book was the travel that made it crazy. I started in Hawaii, then went to Alaska, then jumped into the States, down into Washington. But he is going to be doing it in about 30 days, so probably about 2 weeks before this podcast drops. He's going to be doing 100 triathlons, Ironman triathlons, and 100 days consecutive. But they're all going to be in Utah where he lives. So he won't have to deal with the travel, but it's still 100 days of the 2.3 miles to swim, 112-mile bike ride, and a full-on 26-mile marathon. So looking forward to and supporting him and watching that challenge. You can purchase the book in my show notes. And just scroll down if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening to it on a podcast. You can buy the book in the show notes. I think it's between $10 and $15. It's a great read. He's a phenomenal storyteller and a very talented writer, as he is with many other things in his life. So I'll also put a couple of his handles in there as well. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Subscribe. Love the support. Really appreciate it. Hit me up. Let me know if there's any books you want me to review or you're interested in. Be more than happy to throw those on here. And thanks so much for the support.